time it is. Gotcha! Yes! We're back! We're back! We're back with story time with Chris. Hi. 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 I'm just in a musical mood. I'm just having a great time. I've been listening to a lot of new music lately and also going back and looking at music that I grew up with, not just from my youth, but as a teenager, and mostly looking at J-pop music. J-pop, jazz music, and a lot of newer artists that I've never heard of before. American artists that are new R&B artists, new pop artists, like Sabrina Carpenter is magical, Chaperone is great, Lizzo, still a fan, Lucky Day is awesome, Destin Conrad is pretty cool, Jay Singh is another really cool artist that's cool. Rini Sawayama is also really great. She's fantastic, actually. But I've just been in a musical mood. I love music. Y'all, let me tell you something. Considering that I've watched 2 distinctive anime recently that have honed in the idea of what I've always known. Music can save the world. Music can save the world. A love song can save the world. And the song that I was singing a little bit of, Oboete Misuka, is a Japanese pop song that the title of the song is, Do You Remember Love? Do you remember what love feels like? Do you remember what it makes you feel like? And music can save the day. Music can boost morale. It can liven up our soldiers. It can give people the motivation to complete tasks. It can even stop us from fighting. Music can bring a party together and also end it. So music has always been one of my favorite things, besides reading, of course, that brings about a lot of magic. And we are back with the final installment of a series of unfortunate events. The final installment. We're reading 2 chapters today because I missed last week. I was a bit busy and swamped with work. But let's go ahead and get into this final installment of Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events, The End. And no, I don't own the music that you're listening to in the background, which is brought to you by Mr. Ambiance. Please go ahead and like, share, and subscribe. Hit that bell notification so you don't miss a vid. As I always say, you don't have to watch Storytime with Chris when we go live. You're more than welcome to watch them in your downtime, nap time, max relaxing, chillaxing time, in between time, mean time, scheme time, stay time, break time, CP time, any time that you want to hear a highly animated voice bring you wonderful stories of magic, fantasy, science fiction, adventure, and many, many more in between. Let's go ahead and get started. Chapter 1. If you've ever peeled an onion, then you know that the first thin papery layer reveals another thin papery layer, and that layer reveals another, and before you know it, you have hundreds of layers all around the kitchen table, and thousands of tears in your eyes. Sorry that you ever started peeling in the first place, and wishing that you had left the onion alone to wither away on the shelf of the pantry while you went on with your life. Even if that meant never again enjoying the complicated and overwhelming taste of this strange and bitter vegetable. In this way, the story of the Baudelaire orphans is like an onion. And if you insist on reading each and every thin, papery layer in a series of unfortunate events, your only reward will be 170 chapters of misery in your library and countless tears in your eyes. Even if you have read the first 12 volumes of the Baudelaire story, it is not too late to stop peeling away the layers and to put this book back on the shelf to wither away while you read something less complicated and overwhelming. The end of this unhappy chronicle is like its bad beginning, as each misfortune only reveals another and another and another, and only those with a stomach for this strange and bitter tale should venture any farther into the Baudelaire onion. I'm sorry to tell you this, but that is how the story goes. The Baudelaire orphans would have been happy to see an onion had one come bobbing along as they traveled across the vast and empty sea in a boat the size of a large bed, but not nearly as comfortable. Had such a vegetable appeared, Violet, the eldest Baudelaire, would have tied up her hair in a ribbon to keep it out of her eyes, and in moments would have invented a device to retrieve the onion from the water. Klaus, the middle Baudelaire and the only boy, would have remembered useful facts from one of the thousands of books he had read and been able to identify which type of onion it was and whether or not it was edible. And Sunny, who was just scarcely out of babyhood, would have sliced the onion into bite-sized pieces with her unusually sharp teeth and put her newly developed cooking skills to good use in order to turn a simple onion into something quite tasty indeed. The elder Baudelaires could imagine their sister announcing, "Service," which was her way of saying, "Dinner is served." But the three children had not seen an onion. Indeed, they had not seen much of anything during their ocean voyage, which had begun when the Baudelaires had pushed the large wooden boat off the roof of the Hotel Denouement in order to escape from the fire engulfing the hotel, as well as the authorities who wanted to arrest the children for arson and murder. The wind and tides had quickly pushed the boat away from the burning hotel, and by sunset the hotel and all the other buildings in the city were a distant, faraway blur. Now, the following morning, the only things the Baudelaires had seen were the quiet, still surface of the sea and the gray gloom of the sky. The weather reminded them of the day at Briny Beach when the Baudelaires had learned of the loss of their parents and their home in a terrible fire, and the children spent much of their time in silence thinking about that dreadful day and all of the dreadful days that had followed. It almost would have been peaceful to sit in a drifting boat and think about their lives, had it not been for the Baudelaire's unpleasant companion. Their companion's name was Count Olaf, and it had been the Baudelaire orphans' misfortune to be in this dreadful man's company since they had become orphans and had become their guardian. Olaf had hatched scheme after scheme in an attempt to get his filthy hands on the enormous fortune the Baudelaire parents had left behind, and although each scheme had failed, it appeared as if some of the villain's wickedness had rubbed off on the children, and now Olaf and the Baudelaires were on their same boat. Both the children and the Count were responsible for a number of treacherous crimes, although at least the Baudelaire orphans had the decency to feel terrible about this, whereas all Count Olaf had been doing for the past few years was bragging about it. "I've triumphed," Count Olaf reiterated, a word which here means announced for the umpteenth time. He stood proudly at the front of the boat, leaning against a carving of an octopus attacking a man in a diving suit that served as the boat's figurehead. "You orphans thought you could escape me, but at last you're in my clutches." "Yes, Olaf," Violet agreed wearily. The eldest Baudelaire did not bother to point out that as they were all alone in the middle of the ocean, it was just as accurate to say that Olaf was in the Baudelaire's clutches as it was to say they were in his. Sighing, she gazed up at the tall mast of the boat, where a tattered sail drooped limply in the still air. For some time, Violet had been trying to invent a way for the boat to move even when there wasn't any wind, but the only mechanical materials on board were a pair of enormous spatulas from the Hotel Denouement rooftop sunbathing salon. The children had been using their spatulas as oars, but rowing a boat is very hard work, particularly if one's traveling companions are too busy bragging to help out. And Violet was trying to think of a way they might move the boat faster. "I've burned down the Hotel Denouement," Olaf cried, gesturing dramatically, "and destroyed VFD once and for all." "So you keep telling us," Klaus muttered, without looking up from his commonplace book. For quite some time, Klaus had been writing down the details of the Baudelaire situation in this dark blue notebook, including the fact that it was the Baudelaires, not Olaf, who had burned down the Hotel Denouement. VFD was a secret organization that the Baudelaires had heard about during their travels, and as far as the middle Baudelaire knew, it had been destroyed. Not quite, although quite a few VFD agents had been in the hotel when it caught fire. At the moment, Klaus was examining his notes on VFD and the Schism, which was an enormous fight involving all of its members and had something to do with the Sugar Bowl. The middle Baudelaire did not know what the Sugar Bowl contained, nor did he know the precise whereabouts of one of the organization's biggest agents, a woman named Kit Snicket. The children had met Kit only once before she headed out to sea herself, planning to meet up with the Quagmire triplets, three friends the Baudelaires had not seen in quite some time, who were traveling in a self-sustaining hot air balloon mobile home. Klaus was hoping the notes in this commonplace book would help him figure out exactly where they might be if he studied them long enough. "And the Baudelaire fortune is finally mine," Olaf cackled. "Finally! I'm a very wealthy man, which means everybody must do what I say." "Beans," Sunny said. The youngest Baudelaire was no longer a baby, but she still talked in somewhat unusual way, and by beans she meant something like, "Count Olaf is spouting out pure nonsense," as the Baudelaire fortune was not to be found in the large wooden boat and so could not be said to belong to anyone. But when Sunny said beans, she also meant beans. One of the few things that children had found on board the boat was a large clay jar with a rubber seal which had been wedged underneath one of the boat's wooden benches. The jar was quite dusty and looked very old, but the seal was intact, a word which here means not broken, so the food stored inside was still edible. Sunny was grateful for the jar as though there was no other food to be found on board, but you couldn't help wishing that it had contained something other than plain white beans. It is possible to cook a number of delicious dishes with white beans. The Baudelaire parents used to make a cold salad of white beans. A cold salad of white beans, cherry tomatoes, and fresh basil. And all mixed together with lime juice, olive oil, and cayenne pepper. Actually, that sounds really good right now. That actually sounds really tasty. I'll go over it again for the ingredients. A cold salad of white beans, cherry tomatoes, fresh basil, all mixed together with lime juice, olive oil, and cayenne pepper, which was a delicious thing to eat on hot days. But without any other ingredients, Sunny had only been able to serve her boat mates handfuls of bland white mush. Enough to keep them alive, but certainly nothing in which a young chef like herself could take pride. As Count Olaf continued to brag, the youngest Baudelaire was peering into the jar, wondering how she could make something more interesting out of white beans and nothing else. I think the first thing I'll buy for myself is a shiny new car, Count Olaf said. Something like a powerful engine, so I can drive faster than the legal limit, and an extra thick bumper so I can ram into people without getting all scratched up. I'll name the car Count Olaf after myself, and when people hear the squeal of brakes, they'll say, "Here comes Count Olaf. Orphans, head for the nearest luxury car dealership." The Baudelaires looked at one another, as I'm sure you know it is unlikely for a car dealership to be found in the middle of an ocean. Although I have heard of a rickshaw salesman who does business in a grotto hidden deep in the Caspian Sea, it is very tiresome to travel with someone who is constantly making demands, particularly if the demands are for utterly impossible things, and the children found that they could no longer hold their tongues, a phrase which here means keep from confronting Olaf about his foolishness. Excuse me, I got up early today. My apologies. We can't head for a car dealership, Violet said. We can't head anywhere. The wind was dying out, and Klaus and I are exhausted from rowing. Laziness is no excuse, Olaf growled. I'm exhausted from all my schemes, but you don't see me complaining. Furthermore, Klaus said, we have no idea where we are, and so we have no idea which direction to go in. I know where we are, Olaf sneered. We're in the middle of the ocean. Beans, Snunny said. I've had enough of your tasteless mush. Olaf snarled. It's worse than that salad your parents used to make. All in all, you orphans are the worst henchmen I've ever acquired. We're not your henchmen, Violet cried. We simply happen to be traveling together. I think you're forgetting who the captain is around here, Olaf said, and knocked one dirty knuckle against the boat's figurehead. With his other hand, he twirled his harpoon gun, a terrible weapon that had one last sharp harpoon available for its treacherous use. If you don't do what I say, I'll break open this helmet, and you'll be doomed. The Baudelaires looked at the figurehead in dismay. Inside the helmet were a few spores of the medusoid mycelium, a terrible fungus that could poison anyone who breathed it in. Sunny would have perished from the mushroom's deadly power not so long ago, had the Baudelaires not managed to find a helping of wasabi, a Japanese condiment that diluted the poison. Which, by the way, kids, wasabi is primarily used typically with sushi, which is an amazing dish and one of my favorite things to eat. You wouldn't dare release the medusoid mycelium, Klaus said, hoping he sounded more certain than he felt. You'd be poisoned as quickly as we would. Equivalent flotilla, Sunny said sternly to the villain. Our sister's right, Violet said. We're in the same boat, Olaf. The wind has died down, we have no idea which way to go, and we're running low on nourishment. In fact, without a destination, a way of navigating, and some fresh water, we're likely to perish in a matter of days. You might try to help us instead of ordering us around. Count Olaf glared at the eldest Baudelaire and then stalked to the far end of the boat. You three figure out a way to get us out of here, he said, and I'll work on changing the nameplate of the boat. I don't want my yacht called Carmelita anymore. The Baudelaires peered over the edge of the boat and noticed for the first time a nameplate attached to the rear of the boat with thick tape. On the nameplate, written in a messy scrawl, was the word Carmelita, presumably referring to Carmelita Spatz, a nasty young girl whom the Baudelaires had first encountered at a dreadful school where they were forced to attend, and who later had been more or less adopted by Count Olaf and his girlfriend, Esme Squalor, whom the villain had abandoned at the hotel. Putting down the harpoon gun, Count Olaf began to pick at the table with his dirty, encrusted fingernails, peeling away at the nameplate to reveal another name underneath. Although the Baudelaire orphans did not care about the name of the boat they now called home, they were grateful that the villain had found something to do with his time so they could spend a few minutes talking among themselves. "What can we do?" Violet whispered to her siblings. "Do you think you could catch some fish for us to eat, Sonny?" The youngest Baudelaire shook her head.
"No bait and no net. Deep sea dive?"
"I don't think so," Klaus said. "You shouldn't be swimming down there without the proper equipment. There are other sorts of sinister things that you could encounter." The Baudelaires shivered, thinking of something they had encountered while aboard a submarine called the Queequeg. All the children had seen was a curvy shape on a radar screen that resembled a question mark, but the captain of the submarine had told them that it was something even worse than Olaf himself. "Klaus is right," Violet said. "You shouldn't swim down there. Klaus, is there anything in your notes that might lead us to the others?" Klaus shut his commonplace book and shook his head. "I'm afraid not," he said. "Kit told us she was going to contact Captain Withershins and meet him at a certain clump of seaweed, but even we knew exactly which clump she meant. We wouldn't know how to get there without proper navigation equipment." "I could probably make a compass," Violet said. "All I need is a small piece of magnetized metal and a simple pivot. But maybe we shouldn't join the volunteers. After all, we've caused them quite a deal of trouble." "That's true," Klaus admitted. "They might not be happy to see us, particularly if we had Count Olaf along." Sonny looked at the villain, who was still scraping away at the nameplate. "Useless," she said. Violet and Klaus shared a nervous glance. "Unless what?" Violet asked. Sonny was silent for a moment and looked down at the concierge uniform she was still wearing from her time at the hotel.
"Push Olaf overboard,"
she whispered. The elder Baudelaires gasped, not just because of what Sonny had said, but because they could easily picture the treacherous acts Sonny had described. With Count Olaf overboard, the Baudelaires could sail someplace along without the villain's interference, or his threats to release the medusoid mycelium. There would be one fewer person with whom to share the remaining beans, and if they ever reached Kit, Snicket, and the Quagmires, they wouldn't have Olaf along. In uneasy silence, they turned their gazes to the back of the boat, where Olaf was leaning over to peel off the nameplate. All three Baudelaires could imagine how simple it would be to push him just hard enough for the villain to lose his balance and topple in the water. "Olaf wouldn't hesitate to throw us overboard," Violet said so quietly her siblings could scarcely hear her. "If he didn't need us to sail the boat, he'd toss us into the sea." "VFD might not hesitate either," Klaus said.
"Parents?"
The Baudelaires shared another uneasy glance. The children had recently learned another mysterious fact about their parents and their shadowy past, a rumor concerning their parents, and a box of poisoned darts. Violet, Klaus, and Sonny, like all children, had always wanted to believe the best about their parents, but as time went on, they were less and less sure. What the siblings needed was a compass, but not the sort of compass Violet had mentioned. The eldest Baudelaire was talking about a navigational compass, which is a device that allows a person to tell you the proper direction to travel in the ocean. When the Baudelaires needed a moral compass, which is something inside a person, in the brain or perhaps in the heart, that tells you the proper thing to do in a given situation. A navigational compass, as any good inventor knows, is made from a small piece of magnetized metal and a simple pivot, but the ingredients in a moral compass are not as clear. Some believe that everyone is born with a moral compass already inside them, like an appendix, or a fear of worms. Others believe that a moral compass develops over time as a person learns about the decisions of others by observing the world and reading books, which is how I learned. In any case, a moral compass appears to be a delicate device, and as people grow older and venture out into the world, it often becomes more and more difficult to figure out which direction one's moral compass is pointing. So it is harder and harder to figure out the proper thing to do, which is not necessarily true, because in the words of the Oracle, when you get older, watch this, The Matrix. It's an amazing quadrilogy of movies, which quadrilogy is the proper term because there's 4 movies instead of 3. 4 movies. The Oracle said, "You didn't come here to make the choice, you've already made it. You come to understand why you made the choice." 9 times out of 10, we already know the reason why. It's like So when I was my first year of college, after my first year of college, I came home to Cleveland for the summer, and my niece was playing, oldest niece, Jada, love her to death. She was playing outside, and her ball had rolled into the street. And I remember, without even thinking about it, I grabbed her because a car was coming down the street. She screamed, got scared because I had grabbed her so quickly. I said, hey, you need to pay attention, sweetheart. You cannot be out here. It's very dangerous. You cannot. I understand you're trying to get your ball, but you got to pay attention. If it falls, come get me. Come get an adult. Don't go out in the street. That's what I mean by... You didn't come to make a choice. You've already made it. You come to understand why you made the choice. I already knew in my mind I would do anything for my nieces and nephews. No matter what monster I had to fight, I will always defend them. But now it took the time for me to understand why I did the choice. Why I made the choice I made, because I care. Because I love them. And I would never want anything bad to happen to them. Sometimes in life, we make decisions already knowing what our decision making is going to be. It's just inside of us. That's what it means to have a moral compass. You already know what path you need to navigate. When the Baudelaires first encountered Count Olaf, their moral compasses never would have told them to get rid of this terrible man, whether by pushing him out of this mysterious tower room or running him over with his long black automobile. But now, standing on the Carmelita, the Baudelaire orphans were not sure what they should do with this villain who was leaning so far over the boat that one small push would have simply sent him to his watery grave. But as it happened, Violet, Klaus, and Sunny did not have to make this decision, because at that instant, as with so many instants in the Baudelaire's lives, the decision was made for them, as Count Olaf straightened up and gave the children a triumphant grin. "I'm a genius," he announced. "I've solved all our problems. Look!" The villain gestured behind him with one thick thumb, and the Baudelaires peered over the edge of the boat and saw that the Carmelita nameplate had been removed, revealing a nameplate reading Count Olaf. Although this nameplate too was attached with tape, it appeared that yet another nameplate was underneath this one. "Renaming the boat doesn't solve any of our problems," Violet said wearily. "Violet is right," Klaus said. "We all need a destination, a way of navigating, and some kind of nourishment." "Unless," Sunny said, but Count Olaf interrupted the youngest Baudelaire with a sly chuckle. "You three are really quite slow-witted," the villain said. "Look at the horizon, you fools, and see what is approaching. We don't need a destination or a way of navigating, because we'll go wherever it takes us, and we're about to get more fresh water than we can drink in a lifetime." The Baudelaires looked out at the sea and saw what Olaf was talking about, spilling across the sky like ink, staining a precious document with an immense bank of black clouds. In the middle of the ocean, a fierce storm can arrive out of nowhere, and this storm promised to be a very fierce indeed, much fiercer than Hurricane Herman, which had menaced the Baudelaires some time ago during a voyage across Lake Lachrymose that ended in tragedy. Rest in peace to Aunt Josephine. Already the children could see the thin, sharp lines of rain falling some distance away, and here and there the clouds flickered with furious lightning. "Isn't it wonderful?" Count Olaf asked, his scraggly hair already fluttering in the approaching wind. Over the villain's nefarious chuckle, the children could hear the sound of approaching thunder. "A storm like this is the answer to all your whining." "It might destroy the boat," Violet said, looking nervously up at the tattered sails. "A boat of this size is not designed to withstand a heavy storm." "We have no idea where it will take us," Klaus said. "We could end up even further from civilization." "All overboard," Sunny said. Count Olaf looked at the horizon again and smiled at the storm as if it were an old friend coming to visit. "Yes, those things might happen," he said with a wicked smile, "but what are you going to do about it, orphans?" The Baudelaires followed the villain's gaze to the storm. It was difficult to believe that just moments ago the horizon had been empty, and now this great black mass of rain and wind was staining the sky as it drew closer and closer. Violet, Klaus, and Sunny could do nothing about it. An inventing mind, the notes of a researcher, and surprisingly adept cooking skills were no match for what was coming. The storm clouds unfurled wider and wider like the layers of an onion peeling, or a sinister secret becoming more and more mysterious. Whether that moral compass told them about the proper thing to do, the Baudelaires knew that there was only one choice in this situation, and that was to do nothing, as the storm engulfed the children and the villain as they stood together in the same boat. Excuse me. Sorry. Chapter 2. It is useless for me to describe for you how terrible Violet, Klaus, and even Sunny felt in the hours that followed. Most people who have survived a storm at sea are so shaken by the experience that they never want to speak of it again. And so if a writer wishes to describe a storm at sea, his only method of research is to stand on a large wooden boat with a notebook and a pen, ready to take notes should a storm suddenly strike. But I have already stood on a large wooden boat with a notebook and pen and ready to take notes should a storm suddenly strike, and by the time the storm cleared, I was so shaken by the experience that I never wanted to speak of it again. So it is useless for me to describe the force of the wind that tore through the sails as if they were paper and set the boat spinning like an ice skater showing off. It is impossible for me to convey the volume of rain that fell, drenching the Baudelaires in freezing water so their concierge uniforms clung to them like an extra layer of soaked and icy skin. It is futile for me to portray the streaks of lightning that clattered down from the swirling clouds, striking the mast of the boat and sending it toppling into the churning sea. It is inadequate for me to report on the deafening thunder that rang in the Baudelaire's ears, and it's superfluous for me to recount how the boat began to tilt back and forth, sending all of its contents tumbling into the ocean. First, a jar of beans hitting the surface of the water with a loud glop, and the spatulas, the lightning reflected off their mirrored surfaces as they disappeared into the swirling tides, and lastly the sheets violeted and taken from the hotel laundry room and fashioned into a drag chute so the boat would survive its drop from the rooftop sunbathing salon, billowing in the storm air like jellyfish before striking into the sea. It is worthless for me to specify the increasing size of the waves rising out of water, first like shark fins, and then like tents, and then finally like glaciers, their ice peaks climbing higher and higher until they finally came crashing down on the soaked and crippled boat with an unearthly roar like the laughter of some terrible beast. It is bootless for me to render an account of the Baudelaire orphans clinging to one another in fear and desperation, certain that any moment they would be dragged away and tossed to their watery graves, while Count Olaf clung to the harpoon gun and the wooden figurehead as if a terrible weapon and a deadly fungus were the only things he loved in the world. And it is of no earthly use to provide a report on the front of the figurehead detaching from the boat with a deafening crackle, sending the Baudelaires spinning in one direction and Olaf spinning in the other, or the sudden jolt as the rest of the boat apparently stopped spinning and a horrible scraping sound came from beneath the shuddering wood floor of the craft, as if a gigantic hand were grabbing the remains of the Count Olaf from below, holding the terrible siblings in its strong and steady grip. Subtly and certainly, the Baudelaires did not find it necessary to wonder what had happened now, after all those terrible whirling hours in the heart of the storm, but simply crawled together to a far corner of the boat and huddled against one another, too stunned to cry, as they listened to the sea rage around them and heard the frantic cries of the Count Olaf, wondering if he were being torn limb from limb by the furious storm, or if he too had found some strange safety, and not knowing which fate they wished upon the man who had flung so much misfortune on the three of them. There is no need for me to describe this storm, as it would only be another layer of this unfortunate onion of a story. And in any case, by the time the sun rose the next morning, the swirling black clouds were already scurrying away from the bedraggled Baudelaires, and the air was silent and still as if the whole evening had only been a ghastly nightmare. The children stood up unsteadily in their piece of the boat, their limbs aching from clinging to one another all night, and tried to figure out where in the world they were and how in the world they had survived. But as they gazed around at their surroundings, they could not answer these questions, as they had never seen anything in the world like the sight that awaited them. At first, it appeared that the Baudelaire orphans were still in the middle of the ocean, as all the children could see was a flat and wet landscape, stretching out in all directions, fading into the gray morning mist. But as they peered over the side of their ruined boat, the children saw that the water was not much deeper than a puddle, and this enormous puddle was littered with detritus, there we go. A word which here means all sorts of strange items. There were large pieces of detritus, which comes from the word debris. Yeah. Detritus, detrimental, debris, yeah. There were large pieces of wood sticking out of the water like jagged teeth, long lengths of rope tangled into damp and complicated knots. There were great heaps of seaweed and thousands of fish wriggling and gaping at the sun as seabirds swooped down from the misty sky and helped themselves to a seafood breakfast. There were what looked like pieces of other boats, anchors and portholes, wailings and masts, scattered every which way like broken toys and other objects that might have been from the boat's cargo, including shattered lanterns, smashed barrels, soaked documents, and the ripped remains of all sorts of clothing, from top hats to roller skates. There was an old-fashioned typewriter leaning against a large ornate birdcage with a family of guppies wriggling through its keys. There was a large brass cannon with a large crab clawing its way out of the barrel, and there was a hopelessly torn net caught in the blades of a propeller. It was as if the storm had swept away the entire sea, leaving all of its contents scattered on the ocean floor. "What is this place?" Violet said in a hushed whisper. "What happened?" Klaus took his glasses out of his pocket and where he had put them for safekeeping and was relieved to see they were unharmed. "I think we're on a coastal shelf," he said. "There are places in the sea where the water is suddenly very shallow, usually near land. The storm must have thrown our boat onto the shelf along with all this other wreckage."
Land?
Sunny asked, holding her tiny hand over her eyes as she might see farther.
Don't see.
Klaus stepped carefully over the side of the boat. The dark water only came up to his knees, and he began to walk around the boat in careful strides. "Coastal shelves are usually much smaller than this," he said, "but there must be some island nearby. Let's look for it." Violet followed her brother out of the boat, carrying her sister, who was still quite short. "Which direction do you think we should go?" she asked. "We don't want to get lost." Sunny gave her siblings a small smile.
Already lost,
she pointed out. "Klaus is right. Oh, excuse me. Forgive me, y'all. I'm reading. I'm ingesting the story, and I'm reading too fast, and I apologize. Because I'm like reading ahead to garner my next sentence and prepare, and then I end up mixing up. Sunny's right, Klaus said. "Even if we had a compass, we don't know where we are or where we are going. We might as well head in any direction at all." "Then I vote we head west," Violet said, pointing in the opposite direction of the rising sun. "If we're going to be walking for a while, we don't want the sun in our eyes." "Unless we find our concierge sunglasses," Klaus said. "The storm blew them away, but they might have landed on the same shelf." "We could find anything here," Violet said, and the Baudelaires had walked only a few steps before they saw this was so. For floating in the water were one piece of detritus that wish had blown away from them forever. Floating in a particularly filthy part of the water, stretched out flat on his back with his harpoon gun leaning across one shoulder, was Count Olaf. The villain's eyes were closed underneath his one eyebrow, and he did not move. In all their miserable times with the Count, the Baudelaires had never seen Olaf look so calm. "I guess we didn't need to throw him overboard," Violet said. "The storm did it for us." Klaus leaned down to peer closer to Olaf, but the villain still did not stir. "It must have been terrible," he said, "to try and ride out the storm with no kind of shelter whatsoever."
Kick bucket?
Sunny asked, but at that moment Count Olaf's eyes opened and the youngest Baudelaire's question was answered. Frowning, the villain moved his eyes one direction and then the other. "Where am I?" Spitting a piece of seaweed out of his mouth. "Where's my figurehead?"
Coastal shelf,
Sunny replied. At the sound of Sunny's voice, Count Olaf blinked and stared up, glaring at the children and shaking water out of his ears. "Get me some coffee, orphans," he ordered. "I had a very unpleasant evening, and I like a nice hearty breakfast before deciding what to do with you." "There's no coffee here," Violet said, although there was in fact an espresso machine about 20 feet away. "We're walking west in the hopes of finding an island." "You'll walk where I tell you to walk," Olaf growled. "Are you forgetting that I'm the captain of this boat?" "The boat is stuck in the sand," Klaus asked. "It's quite damaged." "Well, you're still my hench people," the villain said. "My orders are that we walk west in the hopes of finding an island. I've heard about islands in the distant parts of the sea. The primitive inhabitants have never seen civilized people, so they'll probably revere me as a god." The Baudelaires looked at one another and sighed. Revere is a word which here means praise highly and have a great deal of respect for. Like how people revere Beyonce. Which, to each their own, but I'm not a part of that idea. And there was no person the children revered less than the dreadful man who was standing before them, picking his teeth with a piece of seaweed, and referring to people who lived in a certain region of the world as primitive. Yet it seemed that no matter what the Baudelaires traveled, there were people either so greedy that they respected and praised Olaf for his evil ways, or so foolish that they didn't notice how dreadful he really was. It was enough to make the children want to abandon Olaf there on the coastal shelf, but it is difficult to abandon someone in a place where everything is already abandoned, and so the three orphans and the only one villain trudged together westward across the cluttered coastal shelf in silence, wondering what it was in store for them. Count Olaf led the way, balancing the harpoon gun on one shoulder and interrupting the silence every so often to demand coffee, fresh juice, and other equally unobtainable breakfast items. Violet walked behind him, using a broken banister she found as a walking stick and poking at interesting mechanical scraps she found in the muck. And Klaus walked alongside his sister, jotting the occasional note in his commonplace book. Sunny climbed on top of Violet's shoulders to serve as a sort of lookout, and it was the youngest Baudelaire who broke the silence with a triumphant cry. "Land ho!" she cried, pointing into the mist, and the three Baudelaires could see the faint shape of an island rising out of the shelf. The island looked narrow and long, like a freight train, and if they squinted, they could see clusters of trees and what looked like enormous sheets of white cloth billowing in the wind. "I've discovered an island," Count Olaf cackled. "I'm going to make it Olaf Land." "You didn't discover the island," Violet pointed out. "It appears that people already live on it." "And I'm their king," Count Olaf proclaimed. "Hurry up, orphans. My royal subjects are going to cook me a big breakfast, and I'm in a good mood, and I might let you lick the plates." The Baudelaires had no intention of licking the plates of Olaf or anyone else. But nevertheless, they continued walking toward the island, maneuvering around the wreckage that still littered the surface of the shelf. They had just walked around a grand piano which was sticking straight out of the water as if it had fallen from the sky, when something caught the Baudelaires' eyes, a tiny white figure scurrying toward them. "What?" Sunny asked. "Who?" "It might be another survivor of the storm," Klaus said. "Our boat could have been the only one in this area of the ocean." "Do you think the storm reached Kit Snicket?" Violet asked.
Or the triplets,
Sunny said. Count Olaf scowled and put one muddy finger on the trigger of the harpoon gun. "If that's Kit Snicket or some bratty orphan," he said, "I'll harpoon her right where she stands. No ridiculous volunteer is going to take my island away from me." "You don't want to waste your last harpoon," Violet said, thinking quickly. "Who knows where you'll find another one?" "That's true," Olaf admitted. "You're becoming an excellent henchwoman."
poppycock.
Growled Sunny, baring her teeth at the Count. "My sister's right," Klaus said. "It's ridiculous to argue about volunteers and hench people when we're standing on a coastal shelf in the middle of the ocean." "Don't be so sure, orphan," Olaf replied. "No matter where we are, there's always room for someone like me." He leaned down close to give Klaus a sneaky smile as if he were telling him a joke. "Haven't you heard that by now?" It was an unpleasant question, but the Baudelaires did not have time to answer it as the figure drew closer and closer until the children could see it was a young girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old. She was barefoot and dressed in a simple white robe that was so clean she could not have been in the storm. Hanging from the girl's belt was a large white seashell, and she was wearing a pair of sunglasses that looked very much like the ones the Baudelaires had worn as concierges. She was grinning from ear to ear, but when she reached the Baudelaires, panting from her long run, she suddenly looked shy, and although the Baudelaires were quite curious as to who she was, they also found themselves keeping silent. Even Olaf did not speak and merely admired his reflection in the water. When you find yourself tongue-tied in front of someone you don't know, you might as want to remember something the Baudelaire's mother told them long ago, and something she told me even long ago. I could see her now sitting on a small couch she used to keep in the corner of her bedroom, adjusting the straps of her sandals with one hand and munching on an apple in the other, telling me not to worry about the party that was beginning downstairs. "People love to talk about themselves, Mr. Snicket," she said to me, between bits of apple. "If you find yourself wondering what to say to any of the guests, ask them which secret code they prefer, or find out whom they've been spying on lately." Violet, too, could almost hear her mother's voice as she gazed down at this young girl and decided to ask her something about herself. "What's your name?" The girl fiddled with her seashell and then looked up at the eldest Baudelaire.
Friday,
she said. "Do you live on the island, Friday?" Violet asked.
yes.
The girl said,
I got up early this morning to go storm scavenging.
"Storm scavel what?" Sunny asked from Violet's shoulders.
Every time there's a storm, everyone in the colony gathers everything that's collected on the coastal shelf,
Friday said.
"One never knows when one of those items will come in handy. Are you castaways?"
"I guess we are," Violet said. "We were traveling by boat when we got caught in the storm. I'm Violet Baudelaire, and this is my brother, Klaus, and my sister, Sunny." She turned reluctantly to Olaf, who was glaring at Friday suspiciously. "And this is I am your king," Olaf announced in a grand voice. "Bow before me, Friday."
No, thank you,
Friday said politely.
our colony is not a monarchy. You must be exhausted from the storm, Baudelaires. It looks so enormous from shore that we didn't think there'd be any castaways this time. Why don't you come with me? You can have something to eat.
"We'd be most grateful," Klaus said. "Do castaways arrive on this island very often?"
From time to time,
Friday said with a small shrug.
It seems that everything eventually washes up on shores.
"The shores of Olafland, you mean?" Count Olaf growled. "I discovered the island, so I get to name it." Violet peered at Olaf. Friday appeared at Olaf, as well as Violet, curiously, from behind her sunglasses.
You must be confused, sir, after your journey through the storm, she said. People have lived on the island for many, many years.
"Primitive people," sneered the villain. "I don't see any houses on the island."
We live in tents,
Friday said, pointing at the billowing white cloths on the island.
We grew tired of building houses that would only get blown away during the stormy season, and the rest of the time the weather is so hot that we appreciate the ventilation that a tent provides.
"I still say you're primitive," Olaf insisted, "and I don't listen to primitive people."
I won't force you, Friday said. Come along with me and you can decide for yourself.
"I'm not going to come along with you," Count Olaf said, "and neither are my henchpeople. I'm Count Olaf and I'm in charge around here, and not some little idiot in a robe."
There's no reason to be insulting, Friday said. The island is the only place you can go, Count Olaf, so it really doesn't matter who's in charge.
Count Olaf gave Friday a terrible scowl, and he pointed his harpoon gun straight at the young girl. "If you don't bow before me, Friday, I'll fire this harpoon gun at you." The Baudelaires gasped, but Friday merely frowned at the villain.
In a few minutes, she said, all the inhabitants of the island will be out storm scavenging. They'll see any violent act you commit and you won't be allowed on the island. Please point that weapon away from me.
Count Olaf opened his mouth as if to say something, but after a moment he shut it again, and lowered the harpoon gun sheepishly, a word which here means look quite embarrassed to be following the orders of a young girl.
Baudelaires, please come with me,
Friday said, and began to lead the way toward the distant island. "What about me?" Count Olaf asked. His voice was a little squeaky, as it reminded the Baudelaires of other voices they had heard from people who were friends of Olaf himself. They had heard his voice from guardians of theirs and from Mr. Poe when the villain would confront him. It was a tone of voice that had heard from various volunteers when discussing Olaf's activities, and even from his henchmen when they complained about their wicked boss. It was a tone of voice the Baudelaires had heard from themselves during the countless times the dreadful man had threatened them and promised to get his hands on their fortune. But the children never thought they would hear it from Count Olaf himself. "What about me?" he asked again. But the siblings had already followed Friday a short way from where he was standing. When the Baudelaire orphans turned to him, Olaf looked just another piece of detritus that the storm had blown onto the coastal shelf.
Go away,
Friday said firmly, and the castaways wondered if finally they had found a place where there was no room for Count Olaf. Alrighty, and that is where we will end for tonight. I love you all so very much, and thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you next time, y'all. Have a great day.